All right, Doug. Good morning. We are going to talk about a couple of key news items. And the first one relates to COVID, which is something we haven't actually talked about much lately because it seemed like the narrative was collapsing. And not only is it collapsing, it seems like now the narrative is starting to wake up to what's actually happened. We had two situations that have come to mind. One is a Pfizer executive speaking in front of the European Parliament, admitting that Pfizer never bothered to do any testing on how effective the vaccine was in transmissibility. And then number two, you got the Florida Surgeon General doing their own study showing that people who had been vaccinated were something like 84% more likely to have a cardiac issue within 20 days of vaccine. So it seems like the truth is coming out.
And then, of all things from all places, a couple of European politicians have come out and basically announced that they think it was a scam and immoral and things of that nature. I thought it was a scam from the start. Why do I say that? I hate to say things where I don't believe I have any technical expertise, and I certainly don't. I mean, look, I know the basic narrative behind vaccines. It starts with Edward Jenner 200 years ago when he experimented and found out that you could immunize people against smallpox by inoculating them with cowpox, a much less serious disease. I mean, he observed what happened with milkmaids and so forth. So vaccines in one form or another have been around for a couple hundred years. But as time has gone on, vaccines have taken on a life of their own. It's not just a question now of being vaccinated for, serious, deadly diseases. The fact is that children, before they're, forget about before they're 6 years old, much younger than that, are inoculated for 60 to 80 different things. And the worst part of it, I mean, this is knowledge available to anybody, so I didn't have to be a technical expert and make technical judgments to come to the conclusions that I did. But it just seems to me as potentially dangerous that a young kid who is still, his body's developing, his immune system is developing, everything is in flux and developing, his body being inundated with 60 to 80 different foreign things that are looking for their place in his system. And I think few of them are necessary, quite frankly. And when they're all hitting the poor kid at once, perhaps there's something to these allegations that have been made about autism being caused for whatever reason, whether it's mercury or other foreign elements in the vaccines, or just the huge number of vaccines and for all kinds of things coming at once. Yeah, it kind of makes sense to me that there'd be consequences to that.
Yeah,
It's a question of things become corrupt. That when things become accepted and somebody is making these things and doctors are delivering them and it becomes standard operating procedure. It's crazy. Vaccines have gotten a life of their own. I'm not a vaccine denier. I mean, but then it got to annual flu vaccines where it was acknowledged that the flu mutates annually or within the year. And even if you get the vaccine, which might be okay to start with, it'll mutate. And but it's crazy. I mean, flu has been with us as a species since day one for hundreds of thousands of years. Yeah, it can kill you. I mean, if you're old and fat and already sick, yeah, okay. If you want to get a flu vaccine, that's fine. But shoving them down everybody's throat, and then this COVID thing, it's anyway. I was suspicious for all those reasons, which I'm not sure I presented in the most cogent way, but I thought COVID was a scam and a mass hysteria to start with. And maybe we haven't talked about it here as much as we could have or should have. But the problem is that what's in it for me to join the vaccine deniers out there, some of whom are borderline lunatics, and some of them are legitimate scientists. It's I'm happy to say what I think, but
Yeah, we certainly did talk about it though. And to me, the big thing that the red flags I got with it was that it was just such a it was a marketing campaign being rolled out. It was so clearly one-sided, where it was so obvious that it was a coordinated thing. And now we're getting information that all of these celebrities, all these talent agencies were basically given money in order to promote the vaccine. So you had lots of people like celebrities that were going on talk shows and things like that, posting on social media, and they were all paid to do it. And it seemed as though it was being orchestrated like that. And so that made me suspicious, because if you're selling a product and the product actually works, you don't need that. I mean, you need to demonstrate that the product works. And then if it sells itself, especially as something people are worried about people worried about dying. I mean, people were really freaked out about COVID at first. So there's an apt market there for you.
and it's worse than that because any possible discussion of the pluses and minuses of the vaccine, which is jammed through without any testing. I mean, everybody knew that. The FDA, which should be abolished, incidentally, but that's another subject.
If it was ever in doubt before, it shouldn't be now.
Exactly. But there was no discussion about it. If you wanted to ask questions or demand explanations, you were shouted down and criminalized, actually, in some cases. So the whole thing is a control mechanism, as is evidenced by the fact that some European countries came up with vaccine passports, which, supranational passports. I mean, this is people that like to control other people love this kind of crap. Mussolini should be used as an example of what happens to people like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The good news is, I guess, is that the narrative is sort of collapsed and that the truth is coming out about it. And there are real health consequences that are finally being confronted, including, the VAERS database that they're actually looking at it now and determining that there were a huge portion. I wish I could remember, I can't off the top of my head, but it was something like 30% of people had an adverse reaction to one of the injections. So it was a really, really high number that went unreported, or at least undiscussed in the media and with the propaganda team. So, but it's coming out now. It's coming out. But what are people gonna do?
And young people that got it, the incidence of serious cardiac problems increased by a factor of 30.
Right.
And the fact that the virus spread like a virus, everybody got it, and whether they had their vaccination or not, apparently had no real effect on anything, protecting anybody or protecting yourself. So the whole thing is eventually, I think, going to be revealed as a scam. And I hope there are people that are hung for it. And yes, actually, that would be quite appropriate considering the unbelievable amount of damage from every point of view that this gigantic swindle and scam that was perpetrated on the whole world caused.
Well, it seems like there's going to be an awakening moment or awakening period where people are going to realize what happened. It's going to become common knowledge, public knowledge, that we were lied to and misled, and it caused damage. And my question is, the best case scenario would be that you see the people who really perpetrated the fraud would be brought to justice in some way. But I could just as easily see, because of the divisions that have been made around the world between people over the last couple of years, that, there might be a scapegoat in there, or a group of people that's a scapegoat that is not those who are responsible. And so that's my worry, is kind of the blowback, as people wake up to this, they might take it out on the wrong people. I mean, I could maybe the people who didn't get vaccinated, because
Exactly. You can't tell how these things will mutate any more than you can tell how a virus itself will mutate. It's very, very dangerous when something that is analogous to a Salem witch hysteria goes abroad in the entire world. And we have to remember that the bad guys who did this still control the media and academia and the apparatus of the state itself. They're not going to just roll over and say, "Oh, gee, I was wrong. I'm so sorry." So this thing isn't over yet, and it worked so well with the average bovinely stupid American who doesn't know anything about anything that they might try. They might, I guess, the monkeypox thing has apparently that was dead in the water. It never worked.
It was a real hard sell when it became pretty obvious that it was happening at these giant gay orgies, that everyone coming out of it was at those events. It really didn't help get fear into the general population.
But this whole mass viral hysteria, it started with there was Hong Kong flu, and then there was swine flu, then there was bird flu, and there were several other types of flu that were widely promoted as being more deadly or not than the annual flu that comes and goes cyclically and basically just kills elderly people. And to this day, I understand, but who really knows? Because there's no open discussion about any of this stuff. That the average descendant from COVID is still 80 or more, about when people die anyway. And really fat people and people with significant other problems that flu kills anyway. And the normal annual flu, mirabile dictu, has disappeared. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. People will believe anything. So I'm just wondering, what's the next stupid thing they'll believe in? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. Global warming is, I think that will be ramped up on the agenda, because that's where most of the so-called inflation reduction money, that $400 billion that these idiots passed, is supposed to go to fight global warming. So they've got to justify and ramp that up some more. That's dangerous too.
Yeah, and more to just that story, because they're purposely creating resource scarcity that puts people in a position where rationing has to happen. And of course, a lot of this is because of the Russia-Ukraine thing, but it's also because they've been shutting down nuke plants all over the world. They've been killing baseload everywhere in different states in the country. They're killing off their baseload. And I remember reading something about the Illinois governor, that idiot, saying that, oh, well, we don't need these nukes. We'll just buy it from someone else. We'll just buy it from another state. It's like, that's every state's plan. We're going to kill our baseload. We're going to buy it from someone else. They're all going to realize that someone's got to make the energy. And I think that the rationing, I think that's part of explaining it as a global warming problem. You know what I mean? We don't have enough of these things anymore. So we have to, have climate lockdowns. We have to have days you can't travel or something like that. I think the resource scarcity is tied in there intimately.
Well, here's a thought that has been bouncing around in my mind. It's that over the last, 100 years, certainly, but the last 50 years and more as time has gone on, people are moving into the cities everywhere in the world. And I wonder if the fact that people everywhere now are in close contact with each other in cities isn't making them feel on some level like rats or mice that are artificially put into tight, constrained areas, and they start acting crazy and aggressive, and they stop mating with each other. They do.
Yeah, there was that rat utopia experiment, right?
Yes, exactly. So maybe that's one thing that is an unintended consequence of people moving into the cities. That's one possibility, and combined with it is that the digital revolution now, where even two people sitting down having dinner together, very often they don't talk to each other. They're bent over texting on their cell phones.
Yep.
People walk down the street, they're texting. Uh, they're cut off from other real people to a great extent, even though they're living in this rat utopia with too many people, they're cut off from people. And that kind of runs counter to several 100,000 years of our evolution, where, like it or not, we're social animals and we like to hang out with other people like ourselves. So the digital revolution combined with our being forced into rat utopias, perhaps that has something to do with all this. And maybe there are a lot of people out there that say, yeah, the world would be better off if the population was cut in half or cut by 90%.
Yep.
Who knows what's going on?
I think that's why people are taking this whole nuclear threat with Russia so cavalierly. They're talking about it as though it's not a bad thing. And there are articles about how it could be good for the environment, for instance. And there are articles about how we could survive it and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. The drum beats for doing something along those lines are really happening. And I think most people are like, yeah, we could use fewer people around here.
And what was that article that you sent me? It wasn't from Haaretz. Was it the Jerusalem Times that had to do with 15,000 Ukrainians have identified themselves as wanting to put on a mass orgy if the Russians announce that they're or do attack or whatever?
If the Russians use a nuclear weapon, that they're going to engage in a public orgy on some specific hill outside of Kiev with 15,000 people, and it's all a gay sex orgy. Yeah.
Now, to what degree is that a trolling event, and to what degree is it real? Do we know?
Seems real because they had a lot of specific details in that article. They talked about like what you would wear in order to indicate whether or not you were an anal or an oral person, for instance.
Yes. And one of the things that they didn't deal with is, well, what if you're one of these 50 strange genders that we apparently have in the United States? They may be crazy in the Ukraine, but they're not so degraded that they've got to identify themselves as one of 50 genders before they have an orgy.
Well, you can't change the anatomy, Doug. So it's still anal or oral. I mean, that's just all. That's the only options.
Right? Or normal, I suppose,
Yeah.
or whatever. But listen, I always look at the bright side, and the Ukraine has some of the best looking women in the world. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Why are Ukrainian women generally so good looking? And they are. And the reason is that they're not overfed. They're not corn fed like American women are, where they can almost all afford to lose 10 or 20 or 50 pounds, number one. So they're not overfed. That helps them look good. And number two, they don't all have cars, so they walk where they want to go. And they tend to be trim and fit for that reason. So I guess if they're going to have an orgy in the Ukraine, it's worth investigating, except it would only be after.
It was gay. I'm pretty sure it was a gay orgy, Doug.
Gay orgy?
No women in there. I didn't see that part.
Oh, God. This is wishful thinking on my part, I guess. I suspect Zelensky, incidentally, is gay. I know he's got a wife, but who knows what goes on here.
I think they call that a beard, right?
A beard, yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we were talking about the drumbeat for nuclear war, and that's one thing that they announced that they would do, definitely. And I wonder if the Russians would consider that like a retaliatory act against them in some way. I'm not sure it'd be getting back at the Russians for something. I don't get that part.
Yeah, it's funny. People forget that in the past, the enemy du jour, it changes. Like during the 18th and 19th centuries, the big enemy was France, of all things. You had Louis XIV, who was fighting wars against everybody, and then it was followed by the Revolution and then by Napoleon. So everybody we're supposed to hate the French the way we're supposed to hate the Russians today. So it's one damn thing after another. The French hate the Germans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much, like that old song goes. But all things considered, at this point, the Russians are getting a very bad deal. And I'd say that Putin is, in fact, the most thoughtful and the most reasonable and the most well-balanced and knowledgeable of all these degraded European leaders. I'm not in favor of any of them, certainly, but he's not the worst of the bunch, and he's being painted into a corner, and he's been a very cool head.
It's been demonstrated in the last week how he had been holding back that whole time. One of the arguments I made before is it just didn't make any sense how their whole approach, like keeping all the infrastructure in place, even keeping the communications up, all that. And I think I came to understand it, and it's because he expected to have to live with the Ukrainian people afterwards, which makes sense. You don't want to destroy everything they have if you expect to live with them. But it's become clear now that Russia was restraining itself.
Yeah, exactly. So all these idiots that are waving Ukrainian flags should take them down, and not wave Russian flags, but the person that should be viewed as the dangerous demon out there is Zelensky, not Putin.
Thousands and thousands of Ukrainians have died unnecessarily because of all this. I mean, there could have been
unnecessarily
early on. Yep.
And it all started just because, these two Russian provinces, Lugansk and Donetsk, wanted to become independent, and the Zelensky regime said, no, that's not acceptable, and actually fought a real war against these two secessionist provinces. And it was never talked about in the West until the Russians decided to put an end to that, and also bring Crimea, which has always been part of Russia and is full of Russians, back into Russia. I don't believe in the nation state and geographical area, you got to do this and that, but still, within the context of the way the world runs today, these are very reasonable things.
Since Russia stepped up its attacks using missiles that I heard that they didn't have anymore, because they were in the US media, they were saying that they were running out of ammunition. They've been saying it for 6 months now. They didn't have any more missiles, that's why they hadn't been using them. Apparently they have some, but I haven't heard much on the US side, like how the US plans to respond to it. Now, given the fact that Western countries were somehow responsible for Nord Stream, then you have the terrorist attack of the Crimean Bridge. So you have some real acts of trying escalation. I haven't heard much word from US authorities about how they plan to respond to Putin's stepped up action. What do you think? Do you think that they're called to the table, that can be more reasonable now, or do you think that they're just going to put the foot on the gas?
This is the same thing as with COVID. There's no two-sided discussion. There's only propaganda that comes from one source. We don't know what the Russians are saying or thinking. I mean, the speeches that Putin has given, that if you can find them and read them, they're very reasonable. Very, very reasonable. But the average American's unaware of any of this type of thing. And all we hear is unremitting propaganda from Washington, D.C. and other apparatus of the U.S. state and the media. So we don't have any real facts from anywhere. I don't know how this will end. What will the Americans do? What will they do at this point? When the Ukrainians run out of people and run out of war material, because they're not going to ship them new M1 tanks, because the Ukrainian army would take months to be trained to use
how to use them. Yeah, very complicated.
Yeah, it is. And they're not going to rebuild their Air Force with F-16s.
As soon as Putin's reinforcements essentially get staged, they will overwhelm Ukraine in the way that they could have done in the beginning, but weren't set up to do so. To me, it seems like that the Anglos have to do something before that, or else there's no chance.
And maybe someday the question will be asked, well, exactly, where did that $70 billion that was shoveled into the Ukraine go? I mean, exactly where did it go? How about a forensic audit to find out where it went?
Even if they had an unlimited checkbook, could they even spend that much money? I mean, are there enough things that they could buy that would be useful to their effort? Even it's hard for me to imagine.
Yes, I have. It beggars my imagination too. Especially since apparently, but how the hell do we know? The average Ukrainian doesn't have anything.
No.
So where did it all go? It's like the $400 billion that the Inflation Reduction Act, of all things, we've talked about that before.
Yeah.
It's really modern monetary. Where's that all going to go? Exactly whose pockets is it going to go into?
But John Podesta is going to direct it. We know that.
Uh, there's no questioning about anything. God, wait till when it hits the fan. People are so bovinely stupid and so supine. They don't even ask questions about these things.
Well, eventually, when our money stops working for whatever reason, inflated out of a way, or people abandon the dollar internationally or whatever, they're going to start wondering where the money went. I think then, but it'll be too late then. It'll all be gone.
That's right. Oh, it's really quite comical. I mean, I just wish they'd speed it up more. It's like this soap opera is moving too slowly, but I don't want it to move faster because it's going to get ugly. And I'd rather have artificial good times than very real bad times.
It's going pretty fast. If you think about day to day, it feels like it's plodding along. But if you look back in the last 6 months, it is unbelievable the progress we've made in the last 6 months. Even the idea that, again, everyone's talking about all the time in a reasonable, like as though it's reasonable that nuclear exchange could happen. And it might be a good thing. Like that's actually part of the zeitgeist right now. That's pretty shocking. And that's all brand new.
Yeah, it really is. And I really think a lot of these people really do want to see the world population greatly diminished any way possible.
I think you're right.
I'm still betting on biological war as the way that they're going to do it, but well, who knows?